Grace felt her pulse quicken as her mind raced. She knew she was being unfairly targeted, and the people watching seemed unsure whether to step in or keep their distance. She tightened her stance, her years of karate training instinctively kicking in. With a steadying breath, she decided to assert herself without resorting to unnecessary aggression. Exited the ring. "Officer, you need to stop this," Grace said firmly, locking eyes with Miller. "I've done nothing wrong, and your behavior is inappropriate." Her voice carried a calm confidence that momentarily caught Miller off guard. But instead of backing down, his face twisted in anger. "Are you resisting me?" he barked, his grip tightening on her arm. Grace took a step back, forcing him to release her arm, and raised her hand slightly to show she meant no harm. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice steady. "But I will not tolerate being treated like a criminal for no reason. You're out of line." The crowd grew larger now, murmurs of disapproval spreading among the bystanders. Some began pulling out their phones to record the escalating scene, emboldened by Peter's ongoing recording. Miller's confidence wavered slightly as he noticed the attention. Still, he refused to back down, his pride and bias driving his actions. "Step aside and let me do my job," he snapped, reaching again toward Grace. This time, Grace's reflexes took over. As he moved aggressively, she sidestepped, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't strike, but instead used a defensive maneuver to create space between them. Her actions were swift and controlled, a clear sign that she had training and discipline. Miller froze, clearly not expecting her to counter his actions so gracefully. His bravado faltered, and for the first time a flicker of fear crossed his face. The crowd gasped, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Peter, still recording, called out, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Peter," Grace reassured him, her eyes never leaving the officer. "Keep recording." Miller's face reddened with embarrassment and fury. "You think you can defy me?" he snarled. Grace stood her ground. "I'm not defying you, I'm standing up for myself," she said firmly, "and for my son." The crowd began to voice their support, with some shouting at the officer to back off. "Leave her alone," one woman called out. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Miller hesitated, the weight of the growing crowd and the cameras beginning to press down on him. His authority was being challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. Grace, sensing his uncertainty, decided to speak louder, addressing not just him but everyone present. "This is what happens when power is abused," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "We've done nothing wrong, but we're being treated like criminals because of the color of our skin. This has to stop." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers of agreement. Miller's face turned a deep shade of red, his composure cracking under the pressure. He looked around, realizing that he had lost control of the situation. Grace took a step closer to him, her stance calm but resolute. "You have a choice right now," she said. "You can keep escalating this, or you can step back and think about what you're doing. You're not just an officer, you're a person. Act like one." Miller opened his mouth to retort but found no words. The weight of the crowd's eyes and the dozens of recording phones silenced him. With a frustrated grunt, he turned and walked back to his car, slamming the door shut before driving off in a flurry of flashing lights and noise. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in solidarity with Grace. She turned to Peter, pulling him into a tight hug. "You did good," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. One of the bystanders stepped forward, offering Grace a warm smile. "You were incredible," they said. "What you did today, it was brave." "Oh," Grace nodded, her heart still pounding. "I didn't do it just for me," she replied. "I did it for all of us, for Peter, for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." That day, Grace's courage became a beacon of hope for her community. The video of the incident, shared widely on social media, sparked a conversation about systemic injustice and the power of standing up against discrimination. Grace's calm strength and refusal to back down inspired countless others, proving that even in the face of deep-rooted prejudice, one voice could make a difference. And though Grace knew the fight against injustice was far from over, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had shown Peter, and the world, that courage, resilience, and inner strength could light the way, even in the darkest of times. Herself in dangerous situations. Grace's years of karate training had taught her not just how to defend herself physically, but also how to remain composed under pressure. She knew that brute force alone wouldn't resolve the situation, but neither would complete submission. She had to act decisively. In one swift motion, she used a technique from her training to free herself from Miller's grasp. A precise twist of her wrist and a step backward broke his hold, leaving him momentarily stunned. The crowd gasped, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Grace took a firm stance, her eyes locked on Miller, her voice steady but firm. "You have no right to treat me this way," she said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had endured and overcome countless struggles. "This stops now." Miller's face turned red with anger. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone he had already deemed powerless. "You think you can get away with this?" he barked, his voice rising in volume. He lunged toward her again, but this time Grace was ready. With controlled precision, she sidestepped his advance, her movements fluid and deliberate, ensuring she didn't escalate the situation into unnecessary violence. The crowd, now larger and more vocal, erupted in murmurs. Some cheered softly for Grace's courage, while others looked on with a mix of shock and admiration. Peter, still recording, felt a swell of pride and fear. His mother was standing her ground, and while he was terrified for her safety, he knew she was doing the right thing. Sarah, emboldened by Grace's actions, stepped closer and addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about Grace," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is about all of us. If we don't stand up to this kind of injustice, it will keep happening. Today it's Grace. Tomorrow it could be any of us." Her words seemed to ignite something in the bystanders. More people began voicing their support, shouting at Miller to back off. Phones were raised, capturing every moment from every angle. The collective energy of the crowd began to shift, and Miller, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. His authority was being questioned not just by Grace, but by an entire community. "Let her go!" someone shouted from the crowd. Another voice added, "We're all watching you." The murmurs turned into a chorus of discontent. Miller's confidence faltered as he realized the power dynamics were shifting against him. Grace, sensing the change in the atmosphere, decided to speak not just for herself but for everyone watching. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly, who has been judged because of the color of their skin or silenced because they didn't have the power to fight back. I will not be silent." Her words resonated with the crowd, sparking applause and cheers. The momentum was undeniable now. Even those who had been hesitant to get involved felt compelled to join in. People began chanting, "Justice for Grace, justice for all." The sound echoed through the parking lot, a powerful declaration of unity and defiance. Miller, overwhelmed and outnumbered, took a step back. The pressure was too much, and for the first time he appeared unsure of what to do. He glanced around, realizing that his actions were not only being documented, but were also being condemned by the very community he was supposed to serve. At that moment, another police car arrived. 2 officers stepped out, their faces stern but composed. One of them, a senior officer named Captain Harris, immediately assessed the situation. He approached Miller, his tone calm but authoritative. "What's going on here, Officer Miller?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Miller and Grace. Miller stammered, trying to justify his actions, but the presence of the senior officer and the undeniable evidence from the crowd made his excuses fall flat. Harris turned to Grace, his expression softening. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. Grace nodded, still standing tall. "I am now," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she had just endured. Harris addressed the crowd, assuring them that the situation would be investigated thoroughly. He then turned to Miller, instructing him to return to the station for a formal review of his conduct. Miller's face was a mix of anger and humiliation as he reluctantly complied, retreating to his vehicle under the watchful eyes of the crowd. As Miller drove away, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The crowd slowly dispersed, many people stopping to offer Grace words of support and encouragement. Sarah hugged her, her eyes filled with admiration. "You were incredible," she said. "You stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us." Grace was nearly stark naked by the time the crowd surrounded them, but didn't press her to run. Peter, still holding his phone, ran to his mother and hugged her tightly. "Mom, you were amazing," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Grace held him close, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Though the ordeal had been harrowing, Grace knew it wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. Her actions, supported by the community, had sent a powerful message. Standing up against oppression could spark change, even in the face of fear. Grace met his gaze, her eyes sharp and steady as she recounted the events. "We were shopping and returning to our car when Officer Miller demanded my identification without any justifiable reason. When I refused, he used force and tried to arrest me. I had no choice but to defend myself," she explained, her voice steady and unhesitating. The clarity in her words left no room for doubt about what had transpired. Peter, still holding his phone, stepped forward, offering the device to Sergeant Davis. "This video shows everything," he said, his voice a little shaky but filled with determination. The sergeant accepted the phone, and the moment the video began, it documented the entire escalation. Miller's initial demand for ID, the growing tension, and finally, Grace's self-defense. It was clear from the video that Grace had acted only to protect herself, while Miller's actions had been increasingly erratic and violent. As Sergeant Davis watched the video, his expression shifted from confusion to realization. The footage showed Grace's controlled and deliberate movements, each one calculated to protect herself. In contrast, Miller's aggression was evident with every swing of the baton. By the time the video ended, Davis's demeanor had changed entirely. He turned to Grace, his tone now respectful. "You've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice steady. "This is clear. Officer Miller will be investigated for his actions." Miller, still on the ground, refused to meet Davis's gaze. His posture was defeated, and his body language screamed exhaustion. The sense of humiliation was evident. This wasn't just a personal defeat. It was a loss of trust, both from his colleagues and the community. He had failed to maintain control, and now the repercussions of his actions would unfold. A pathway to growth and redemption. For Grace, her battle was not just for herself, but for others who had been subjected to injustice and discrimination. She became an advocate, using her own painful experience as a platform to shed light on the struggles that many faced every day. Her story resonated with people from all walks of life, but especially with women and minorities who often felt marginalized. Grace's resilience sparked a ripple effect, encouraging people to speak up, to demand respect, and to challenge the systems that allowed injustice to thrive. Through workshops, talks, and community events, she became a symbol of courage and a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for far too long. Meanwhile, Officer Miller's journey was far more internal. Initially, he struggled with denial, unable to see the full extent of his actions and their consequences. However, as time passed, and after intense reflection and forced participation in ethics and anti-racism training, Miller began to understand the deeper implications of his actions. His work became more than just about following orders or enforcing the law. It was about recognizing his responsibility to uphold the rights and dignity of every individual, regardless of their background. The shift in Miller's awareness was not immediate, nor was it easy, but he began to see the value of confronting the biases that had previously shaped his worldview. His commitment to change, while not erasing the damage he had caused, was a crucial step toward becoming a more empathetic and accountable officer. It was a painful process, but it was one that allowed him to recognize that even when mistakes are made, there is always an opportunity for growth, understanding, and ultimately, redemption. The transformation in both Grace and Miller was a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the willingness to learn from one's mistakes. Grace, who had endured the full brunt of Miller's aggression, became an active agent of change in her community. Her involvement in initiatives to combat racial and gender-based discrimination in law enforcement highlighted the importance of continuing the fight for justice in every sphere of society. Her journey was not just about making her voice heard. It was about empowering others to find their own strength. Grace's commitment to justice and her dedication to ensuring that no one else had to face what she did was unwavering. For her, the battle wasn't just a moment in time. It was the start of a larger movement that aimed to dismantle the injustices built into the systems around her. Grasses. As for Miller, while his career would never be the same, the opportunity to make things right was a lesson he would carry with him throughout his life. The path to redemption was hard and required him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own actions. But he learned that growth often comes through adversity, and that even the most difficult experiences could serve as a catalyst for change. In the end, the story of Grace Johnson and Officer Miller was not just a singular event, but a microcosm of a much larger struggle for justice. Grace's actions, fueled by love for her son and a deep sense of right and wrong, inspired countless others to stand tall in the face of adversity. And Miller's eventual willingness to acknowledge his wrongs, to learn, and to grow, demonstrated that change is possible, even for those who have fallen short. Their story proved that while injustice may persist in the world, individuals, communities, and even those within the systems themselves have the power to confront it, change it, and create a future where justice prevails for all. The confrontation in that parking lot was the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that reached far beyond that moment and had a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. The next day, the story of Grace and Officer Miller represents more than just a single event of confrontation. It serves as a reminder of the possibility of growth and transformation, even in the face of grave mistakes. For the Fairhaven community, Grace became not only a symbol of resilience against discrimination, but also a beacon for the potential for personal learning and change. Miller, though initially resistant, slowly worked to improve himself and learn from his errors, proving that change, no matter how difficult, is always within reach. Their journey together continues to inspire future generations, highlighting the need to stand up not only for ourselves, but also for a fairer, more just society. As time passed, Grace's actions began to be honored in various ways. The community came together to recognize her courage, not just for defending herself, but for confronting social injustice head-on. Ceremonies and discussions were held in her honor, celebrating her strength and the impact she had on raising awareness about the need for fairness and equity. Her story gave confidence to many, especially women and people from minority groups, encouraging them to speak out against the discrimination and oppression they faced daily. Grace didn't stop there. She became even more determined to use her experience to inspire others. Her work shifted to a new mission, to encourage and empower those who wanted to change society for the better. Grace instilled in her son Peter the values of perseverance, strength, and courage, while also teaching him the importance of fairness, tolerance, and standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. Peter, despite the traumatic experience he witnessed, learned valuable lessons about the importance of doing what's right, regardless of the challenges that might arise. As Grace's story spread, it became an important part of local school curricula. Teachers used it as an example of modern-day strength and determination, showing students how to act in the face of injustice and how to fight for their rights and the rights of others. She became not only a role model for Peter, but for countless young people in Fairhaven, inspiring them to take action when they saw injustice and to push for change. Grace's influence extended beyond her immediate circle. The Fairhaven community began to undergo a transformation. Groups that had previously been passive or silent about racial discrimination started seeking ways to make a difference. Human rights organizations and anti-racism groups within the community took action by organizing workshops, discussions, and events to raise awareness of social issues. Thanks to Grace's efforts, the community was no longer able to avoid the difficult conversations about discrimination, inequality, and injustice. They began to face these issues head-on, something that had been difficult for them before. On the other hand, Miller's journey was not as straightforward. After being suspended, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions and the damage they had caused. Rather than retreating in shame or regret, Miller chose to take responsibility for his mistakes and seek redemption. He enrolled in courses on racism and ethics, where he came to understand that racism was not only harmful to its victims, but also detrimental to his own career and reputation. Through these courses, he learned that being a police officer was not simply about enforcing laws, but about ensuring the rights and dignity of all people, regardless of race, gender, or background. Miller's path to change was difficult. However, he continued to challenge himself by attending citizen rights workshops and collaborating with human rights organizations. Over time, he became an advocate for improving relationships between the police and the community. He shared his personal journey with others, encouraging his colleagues to learn and grow, and to approach their work with more empathy and fairness. Although the road to redemption was long, Miller's actions demonstrated that anyone, even someone who had made grave mistakes, could change and become a better version of themselves. This transformation wasn't just confined to Miller. Even those who had initially opposed Grace, like Tom, began to shift their perspectives. Tom had initially sided with the police, viewing the situation from a neutral standpoint. However, after witnessing Miller's efforts to atone for his actions and listening to perspectives from Sarah and others in the community, Tom began to reconsider his own views on social issues. He participated in discussions on racism and the importance of respecting everyone's rights, gradually changing his attitude and becoming more aware of the inequalities present in society. Ultimately, the story of Grace and Miller became not just a tale of confrontation, but also one of change, redemption, and personal growth. Grace, through her bravery and perseverance, not only became a victor in a tense encounter, but also a catalyst for transformation within her community. Her strength in the face of adversity became a powerful symbol of what can be achieved when one stands up for what is right. Her journey toward justice was not just about winning in the moment, it was about creating lasting change. Her opponent's feet, knocking Miller off balance. He stumbled backwards, catching himself on the car, his face twisted in disbelief. Grace, despite her rising adrenaline, remained composed. She knew this wasn't just about physical strength. It was about sending her ground, about sending a message that she wouldn't let anyone, no matter their authority, get away with treating her or her son unjustly. The crowd had grown silent, some looking in awe, others in shock. What was happening was beyond just a mother defending herself. It was a moment of defiance against a system that had too often taken advantage of the vulnerable. Peter, standing close by, his phone still recording, felt his heart racing. He couldn't help but admire his mother's strength. This was the woman who had always protected him, who had taught him to fight for what was right, no matter the odds. Grace locked eyes with Miller. Her breath was steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "You've had enough," she said, her voice ringing out with clarity. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight behind them, the defiance that was impossible to ignore. Her heart pounded, but she refused to be intimidated. Officer Miller, struggling to regain control, tightened his grip on the baton, his knuckles white. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. He had not expected this kind of resistance. His usual tactics had no effect on this woman, and the crowd's reaction only made things worse. He could feel their gaze on him, the disapproving whispers growing louder. He was no longer the authority figure, he was the one being challenged. "Step back," he ordered, his voice low and strained, though it lacked the authority it had earlier. But his command was ignored. Instead, the crowd inched closer, emboldened by Grace's unwavering stance. Then Sarah, who had been watching in the background, stepped forward again. "This has gone far enough," she called out. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that sent a ripple through the crowd. "You can't intimidate people like this anymore, not here, not in front of us." Her words resonated with others who had been silently observing. Several of them nodded, their phones still recording, capturing every moment. It wasn't just Grace being supported now. It was everyone in the crowd who believed in fairness, in justice. People began to speak up, their voices growing stronger as they sided with Grace, challenging the officer's behavior. Miller's eyes darted from one person to the next. He could feel the pressure mounting. His authority was slipping, and the crowd's murmurs were growing louder, more insistent. "You're all out of line," he spat, his voice cracking under the strain. He looked like a man who had underestimated the situation, and now he was paying the price. But Grace wasn't done. She knew that she couldn't stop now. Miller's baton was still raised, his eyes filled with rage and frustration. She couldn't let him regain control. Grace's instincts kicked in once more, and she shifted her weight, moving swiftly to avoid the next strike. She blocked his swing again, this time with even more precision, using her forearm to deflect the baton and causing Miller to stagger back once again. Her movements were fluid, controlled, and graceful, a testament to years of training that had prepared her for this moment. Miller's confidence was crumbling. He swung wildly this time, desperate to regain the upper hand. But Grace anticipated his every move, dodging and countering with expert precision. She was a whirlwind of calm, her body reacting instinctively, her focus unwavering. As Miller tried to regain his footing, Grace used the momentum of his final wild swing to push him off balance. He lost his grip on the baton and it clattered to the ground. For a moment there was silence. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Miller, now visibly shaken, struggled to pick himself up. Grace stood tall, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was standing up for her son, for everyone who had ever been oppressed, for anyone who had ever felt the weight of unjust power pressing down on them. Peter, still filming, couldn't believe his eyes. His mother had just taken control of the situation in a way that he had never imagined. She had done more than protect herself. She had shown everyone around her that it was possible to stand up against injustice. His heart swelled with pride, but fear still gnawed at him. He knew things weren't over yet. Officer Miller, finally collecting himself, stood up, his face flushed with anger. His chest heaved as he glared at Grace, fury in his eyes. His pride had been wounded and he was determined not to back down, despite the mounting pressure from the crowd. He reached down for the baton, but before he could grab it, Sarah moved forward, positioning herself between Miller and Grace. "This ends now," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You've done enough." The entire crowd seemed to hold their breath as the standoff continued, but the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Grace had proven that even in the face of overwhelming force, courage and unity could turn the tide. The moment had become a symbol, a powerful act of resistance against the misuse of power. Miller, sensing that the situation had slipped beyond his control, hesitated for a moment. The voices of the crowd, the weight of their collective gaze, the presence of Sarah and others standing firm, it was too much. For the first time, Officer Miller seemed uncertain. His grip on the baton loosened as doubt crept into his mind. And in that moment, Grace knew it was over. She had not only protected herself and her son, but she had also sent a message to everyone watching. They had seen what it looked like to resist, to challenge the unjust systems that had so long been in place. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs continuing, but now they were no longer just whispers of uncertainty. They were words of solidarity. Grace, though exhausted, stood tall, her head held high, her eyes still locked on Officer Miller. She had done it. The fight was far from over, but this moment was a victory. Miller, still on the ground, struggled with the realization that he had been bested. His face burned with shame and anger, but his body remained slumped, his pride shattered. The crowd that had once watched in silence now buzzed with energy. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. People who had been bystanders now spoke up, many showing clear support for Grace. The sound of phone cameras clicking and the flashes of recording devices filled the air, each one capturing the moment for the world to see. Grace stood firm, her breath heavy from the confrontation, but her resolve unwavering. She looked at Peter, who was still recording, his phone shaking slightly in his hand, but his determination clear. "I'm fine, Peter. Keep filming," she said, her voice steady even though her body felt the strain. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever suffered under the weight of unjust authority. The crowd continued to cheer, a ripple of solidarity flowing through them. Sarah, standing near the front of the crowd, offered her words of encouragement. "Grace, you're doing great. Don't let him push you around." Her voice rang out, loud and clear, offering moral support from a distance. Though she wasn't directly involved in the confrontation, Sarah's presence was a powerful reminder that Grace was not fighting alone. Meanwhile, Tom, who had once defended Miller's actions, now felt a deep unease. He stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, his mind racing. He had initially thought Miller was just doing his job, but the brutality of the officer's actions had changed his perspective. The way Miller had swung the baton at Grace, the force he had used, it was too much. It was clear to Tom now that what he had once dismissed as part of Miller's duty was actually an abuse of power. Tom slowly made his way over to Sarah, his expression conflicted. "I think I was wrong," he admitted quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't think it would go this far." Sarah turned to him, her eyes softening. "It's okay, Tom," she said calmly. "What matters now is what we do to fix it." She gestured toward the crowd, her words full of resolve. "We can't stand by and let this continue." Tom nodded, as if something inside him had clicked into place. He pulled out his phone and began recording, just like so many others around them. It was a small action, but it marked a significant change in his understanding. He was no longer just a bystander. He was now an active participant in documenting the truth. Miller, on the other hand, was beginning to lose his grip on the situation. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a look of confusion and desperation. The crowd had shifted, and he was no longer just facing Grace. He was up against the entire community, their eyes locked on him, their voices rising in unison to reject his actions. Grace's defiance had given the crowd the courage to speak up, and now Miller was realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. The air grew thick with tension. Miller, frustrated and humiliated, tried to regain control of the situation by continuing to assert his authority. But the more he pushed, the more the crowd pushed back. He could feel their disapproval, and it only made his anger grow. Sweat poured down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as he faced off against a woman who had shown him and everyone else that courage and justice could defeat the abuse of power. Then, as if to seal his defeat, the sound of sirens pierced the tension in the air. Additional police vehicles arrived, their lights flashing in the distance, and the familiar screech of tires signaled the arrival of backup. As the patrol cars came to a halt, new officers stepped out, surveying the scene. They paused for a moment, taking in the unusual sight before them. Miller, once the embodiment of authority, sat slumped on the ground, his face bruised and filled with humiliation. Grace, on the other hand, stood tall, her posture resolute, her gaze unwavering. Sergeant Davis, one of the newly arrived officers, took a step forward, his expression a mixture of authority and concern. He surveyed the scene, his eyes shifting from Miller to Grace, who stood unflinching in the face of his scrutiny. "Ma'am," Davis began, his voice calm but firm, "can you explain to me what happened here?" Today, Grace's story continues to resonate far beyond the boundaries of Fair Haven. It serves as a lesson in strength, perseverance, and courage, reminding us that even in the darkest moments, there is always room for growth and change. Grace didn't just change her own life, she helped change her community, inspiring others to stand up for justice and to believe that, with determination, anyone can learn from their mistakes and become a better person. Grace and Peter continue to live their lives, but their story remains an inspiration to all who fight for what is right, for justice, and for a society free of discrimination. Grace's actions have left an indelible mark, proving that through resilience and courage, change is not only possible but necessary. The story of Grace and Miller is a powerful reminder that even in the face of adversity, we all have the potential to change, grow, and help build a more just world. Their story reminds us that we each have a role to play in shaping a society where justice prevails, and where the values of fairness, equality, and respect guide our actions. May we all find the strength to stand up for what is right, just as Grace did, And may we, like Miller, be willing to face our flaws and strive for redemption.